Welcome to the Richard Urban Show, where we present news and views from God's point of view. Today, we're very happy here to have with us Alan Whitt. He's a candidate for the Senate, United States Senate here in West Virginia, and he's running in the Republican primary June 9th against Shelley Moore Capito. So welcome again, and please introduce yourself and tell us about yourself. We'd like to hear that.
Hey, well, Richard, I'm honored to get to be on with you and your viewers. My name is Alan Whitt. I am a proud West Virginian. I have been the president of the Family Policy Council of West Virginia, coming up on 7 years now, and we defend faith, family, and freedom within the state of West Virginia, down at the Capitol, at your local county courthouse, at your city council meeting. But before I got here, I was honored to get to grow up in a strong family on my grandfather's dairy farm. Learned to milk cows from the time I was about 3. One of my fondest memories is sitting on my grandmother's lap as she milked the cow and would squirt the cat in the face as he would come into the milking stall.
I like that.
The cat liked it too. But I graduated with a degree in communications from Auburn University, where I was a decathlete. Was a teammate of Bo Jackson's a long time ago, back in the dinosaur era. But I am grateful to get to be on with you today. Nothing is more important than family, than faith, than being able to live freely. And as we all know, that politics is really a substitute for war. The more tender-hearted among us hate to hear it characterized like that, but that's the reality. In the less civilized nations, people are killing each other over differences of opinion, over differences of religion, over whose property line really is 2 feet farther that way versus 2 feet farther my way. And the United States is blessed, over the last couple of hundred years, 240 or so, to have rarely ever been at war. We've had a small handful of times, and they've been awful, but we've been, as a country, mostly blessed to not have to fight out our disagreements with the sword. And politics is kind of a substitute for that. And so people get unhappy when they see a TV ad that's biting, or I saw one yesterday that our current governor is running against his opponent, Woody Thrasher, that actually has an overflowing toilet with sewage, which I find to be quite distasteful. You're not going to see anything like that from me, but that's still far better than settling our disputes in a duel in the middle of the street.
That's true. Yeah, you're right.
So, but I've been called on to be the state's chief lobbyist to defend faith, family, and freedom through my nonpartisan organization, the Family Policy Council. And we are associated with Focus on the Family. We are partners with several other national organizations like the Family Research Council and a network of family policy councils all over the country. And so I'm called on to try to make sure that laws that defend faith, family, and freedom are being put forth and are passed, and that we have the right people in place. So part of my job is to recruit candidates to run for office at the lower levels. And then my job is also to make sure that if somebody puts forward a bill that is going to take a bite out of our individual liberties, is going to punish us for expressing our faith, or if it is going to in some way negatively impact the traditional family unit, well, then we're going to step in and do our best to make sure those bills never see the light of day, or if they come to a vote, that we've got enough votes to defeat those. So that's my day job. So that's what I've spent doing for the last 10 years and the last 7 years almost here in West Virginia.
Okay. So what would you say are the 3 most important, well, you've mentioned several things that would indicate, but maybe you could repeat or spell out the 3 most important campaign platform points that you have, for your campaign.
Well, in no particular order, the First Amendment that's spelled out in the United States Constitution, it unfortunately, because we live in a fallen world where man tends to look out for number one, we'd like to be able to think that we all put God first, others second, and ourselves third, but that's just not reality. Most people are putting themselves first. It's my needs and my wants above everybody else's. And so therefore we have to have a form of governing people who have that mindset. And Benjamin Franklin said that the fact that we have a formal government is evidence of the failure of the people to be able to govern themselves. So it's what we're dealing with, what we're left with. So we have to make the best of not a great situation, and that is try to put good people in office to help govern. And the thing that pops up on my radar very quickly is that the Constitution says that we've got the First Amendment right of free speech, or the very first time that our founding fathers had to go in and make a change or make an edit to the Constitution, that very First Amendment said we shall protect free speech. But the Second Amendment says, well, unfortunately, because we're dealing with some people who put themselves first, we need the Second Amendment. We're going to have the right to bear arms in order to protect the First Amendment. So we've seen a resurgence as of late, especially in West Virginia, with many of our counties and even smaller burgs and towns rising up in the last few months. I was able to participate in the very first one down in Fort Gay, West Virginia, where a local city council says, hey, we're going to become a sanctuary city for the Second Amendment. You shall not infringe upon the Second Amendment in Fort Gay, West Virginia. And then we had multiple county commissions began to pick that mantra up. We followed, obviously, on the heels of Virginia.
That's interesting. Let me ask a question. So
Sure.
I know that was a thing in Virginia with Governor Northam, whatever, passing the red flag type laws. Is that a thing here in West Virginia too? I mean, do you feel it's really needed? What's coming down the pike? Is there something maybe I don't know about?
Well, most of the counties in West Virginia, not all, I think close to 90% now, have also followed suit, followed Virginia's lead after, the governor in Virginia began to say some very scary and unconstitutional things. So basically, in solidarity with our sister East Virginia, as I like to refer to them, the Commonwealth of Virginia, it was more of a solidarity move when our counties and some of our cities began to say, hey, we are, just in case any public official here were to ever stand up and say, we're going to begin to infringe upon the Second Amendment like the governor did in Virginia, well, we're going to be ahead of the curve and we're not going to be reactionary. We're going to be proactive. And that's what that was about in West Virginia.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about, so interestingly, like with the current, lockdowns, I mean, to me, I believe that's very unconstitutional. And I'm not happy with Governor Justice just to say randomly, and of course he's with whatever 45 other governors or 43 saying, hey, you can't gather more than 5 or 10 or 50. Hey, don't go out of your house. Go to this store. Don't go to that store. Don't open your business. Do you feel those lockdowns are unconstitutional?
Well, we do have a Supreme Court precedent that allows governors very specifically in times of quarantine to be able to restrict movement of the state's citizens. Now, the president of the United States doesn't have it, but in 1826 or 1828, I forget which date, we had a case in Pennsylvania specifically about quarantines. And that case still looms large, so much so that they actually have a concept called the quarantine effect. When something is challenged on the constitutional level, it has to work its way up through your local state courts and through the federal district courts, and then all the way, hopefully the Supreme Court will take it up. But so this quarantine effect basically means that if a governor puts a quarantine into place, by the time someone who can challenge its constitutionality, the quarantine will likely have already been lifted. And so most people don't bother to follow through with the years of court cases that it would take, especially if you actually do have something like COVID-19, where we're actually seeing people pass away, actually people being maimed, losing limbs, etc. When the public can actually see that at least some of their friends and neighbors are ill and are leaving us, well, then it's not very politically popular for someone then to begin to try to sue to lift a quarantine. So I do believe that governors have the constitutional right to do so, but here's where we run into problems. And that is, the governor should not be allowed to pick and choose which entities are open. This concept of, well, you're essential versus non-essential, my goodness, that 1800s court case most certainly did not define essential workers and picking winners and losers. For example, you can go to Walmart right now and see the long lines and see the social distancing X's marked off on the sidewalk, and there's people coming and going all day long, or the big box stores, Lowe's and Home Depot and some of those others. But Ace Hardwares are closed. Your mom and pop hardware store in small town West Virginia are closed. Your restaurants are closed for in-seating dining, or at least most of them were.
Well, right. It seems rather random. I mean, I hadn't heard about that. What were they quarantining for in that rule you're talking about? I never heard that argument. I mean, I've seen a lot of discussion of constitutional issues, and I believe those are very important. I mean, I don't see anywhere in the West Virginia U.S. Constitution where it's saying about anything like this. I've never heard of such thing. Usually quarantine sick people, not well people.
Well, and there's another point that's going to have to be determined, and I'm confident it will be vetted this time. We're at a different time in civilization, and I believe that some of our constitutionalists are going to actually press forward on these abuses of power. Because when you say a church like Governor Beshear in Kentucky next door, when a church said, well, we're not going to actually meet, we're just going to all pull up in the parking lot, we're going to stay in our cars, and we're going to listen to the weekly services over the loudspeaker.
Right, I heard about that.
And Governor Beshear says, no, you're not. You're not even going to drive into the parking lot. Okay, there was zero risk of contamination of people driving up in their cars and listening to someone on a loudspeaker. But no, you're not going to. And said, we'll fine you. If you don't pay the fine, we'll incarcerate you, take away your freedom. Well, this is lunacy. And so this is going to have to all be vetted out. I'm going to encourage some of my colleagues that are constitutional attorneys to press forward. And they won't even need my encouragement. There are going to be a multitude of constitutionally based lawsuits that challenge this portion.
Yeah, in Maryland, I know there's already a case of some of the delegates. The delegate claims that actually, well, he was threatened even, by the whatever state police told him, hey, you might be arrested. But that's pretty outrageous. Yeah, well, I know I asked you about 3 points. I do have some questions, but did you have another point you wanted to make to get back to that question?
The First Amendment has to be defended. And we're at a place where we're having to defend First Amendment issues that we thought we never would before, like basic biology. I hold to the traditional and scientific belief that humanity is bifurcated into two sexes, male and female. And that biology and science from time on in has proven that. Yeah. And especially for someone who grew up on a dairy farm, who was well-versed in animal husbandry, it takes a bull and a heifer in order to make that next generation of cows.
True.
And we knew better than to mix up the names. And now here humanity is at this politically correct place where we're taking individuals that are suffering perhaps from known diagnosable psychiatric illnesses like gender dysphoria, where I or you, Richard, would all of a sudden one day become confused and say, I'm not a male member of the species, I'm a female member of the species, and therefore all other teachers, social workers, law enforcement, businesses now have to participate in my dysphoria at the point of a gun. Again, Harper's Ferry, right there where you're broadcasting from, has a city ordinance that says if you fail to call someone by their preferred pronouns or misgender an individual, then you're in violation of city ordinance. You don't pay the fines for that. they incarcerate you.
Wow.
Well, so
Yeah, actually, I'm in Shenandoah. Address Harper's Ferry, but
uh,
close enough. Close enough.
gotcha. You're up on the mountain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a great, a beautiful place there through Shenandoah. I've been there many times. But so, what the voters who are going to watch us today need to know is that I am the only candidate running for United States Senate in the Republican Party. Well, the only candidate in either party that believes that that Nancy Pelosi's Fairness Act that passed out of the House last year that would take Harper's Ferry's ordinance and make it a federal law nationwide, where if you dared misgendered someone, then it becomes a civil rights violation of which you go to prison for.
Yeah, that's
so
wrong.
okay, Senator Capito and I differ on this. And when constituents asked her specifically, are you in favor of this bill? Her two responses to constituents, her written responses were, well, I don't think anybody should be discriminated against. And then later on, she said, well, let's wait and see what it looks like when it comes out of the Senate committee. No, no, no. There is nothing about that egregious bill that should be given a moment's consideration for anyone who says they're conservative and for anyone who's attempting to uphold the Republican platform. The Republican platform speaks very clearly that marriage is created for one biological male and one biological female for life. That is the Republican Party's position. That is not Senator Capito's position. And Senator Capito has gone farther than just making those generic non-committal statements. But Senator Capito's campaign is run by an individual named Kent Gates, who is a known same-sex activist, campaigned voraciously for Prop 8 in California, which are against Prop 8. Of course, even California just a few years ago.
Yeah, I remember that well.
Yeah, we're going to define marriage as one man, one woman, even
Right.
California. And Senator Capito's campaign advisor, many years long, her advisor, was a voracious activist attempting to defeat that. And he's had his influence on the Harper's Ferry type ordinances around the state as well. So we are not the same kind of Republicans. And so the First Amendment is under attack in West Virginia. I'm the only candidate running for the United States Senate that says, hey, I will absolutely stand in opposition to any of those types of fascist activist organizations that want to shut a business down because they want to adhere to biology.
Okay.
So there's number one. The Second Amendment defends my First Amendment. So I'm an avid shooter, gun owner, and I hate that we have to have that as an option. Again, back to the civility of man. But right now it's where we are, and so I don't want anybody stepping in to West Virginia or any state and saying a family is not able to bear arms in order to defend themselves. And then third, we have to have a smaller government. Again, Benjamin Franklin says we hate that we got to have it, but it's evidence of the failure of man. But since we do have it, let's have as little as possible, as little intrusiveness, the least amount of intrusiveness that we can have in order to run our businesses. Because you've got a media program here, a media company, Richard, and I think that the government should have as light a touch as possible on what you do any given day.
Right.
And I think that holds true for any business owner. And it's another area where the current senator, the current incumbent, and I disagree. She believes that that a big government can actually be of benefit to West Virginians. When we had the opportunity to stand behind our current president in 2017 to repeal Obamacare, which I'm a staunch pro-life conservative. Again, I'm the only 100% pro-life candidate in the race in either party. And Planned Parenthood, which is obviously notorious for taking government money in the slaughter of the unborn. There were millions of dollars of funding for Planned Parenthood in Obamacare, still is. And in 2017, we had the ability. We got it out of the House, got it over to the Senate, and there were 4 liberal Republicans who would not commit to the straight repeal, and Senator Capito was one of those. And finally, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell realized he was not going to have the votes. If he brought it to the floor, it was going to fail and humiliate the president, so he had to withdraw it. And Senator Capito was one of the 4 that wouldn't cross over, that wouldn't do the right thing. Right. So even later on, when they attempted the repeal and replace bill, she, for weeks, would not publicly commit to voting for that repeal and replace, which was much weaker than just a straight repeal. I, along with West Virginians for Life, joined together in a joint press release, an open letter to the senator in 2017, and said, listen, if you are unwilling to vote yes on this, then all options have to be on the table in the primary in 2020. It's the first time ever our 2 organizations, that Life organization and mine, issued it's the only time we've ever issued a joint press release. Hoppy Kercheval on the Metro News Radio interviewed the senator just a few minutes after we released that press release and caught her off guard. She still was unwilling to commit to voting one way or the other. And what we now know is that, of course, history told us that Senator John McCain came in with his famous thumbs down and killed the repeal and replace, so we still have Obamacare.
Right.
Word began to circulate earlier that morning that Senator McCain was going to join with Jeff Flake and a couple of the others, and so the Republicans weren't going to have enough votes to even do the repeal and replace. Obamacare was going to remain. And once that word began to circulate, only after that in the halls of the U.S. Senate did Senator Capito then finally vote for the repeal and replace, when it really wasn't going to make any difference. And perhaps she voted for it specifically for this primary election as political cover. So the big 3 that you asked me earlier on: 1, the First Amendment has to be defended. We have to have the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment to defend that. And then thirdly, we have to have the ability to shrink our government down to the point where, other than on safety concerns or to make sure that we don't have unfair business practices where a monopoly is stepping on the little guy, we need to pare this down as much as we can.
Okay, so something related to, since I'd say the last 2 decades, there are a lot of assaults on the constitutional rights. And I know that fairly recently there was a bill to defund the NSA, National Security Agency surveillance program, which, collects basic data on everything everybody does. And then there was just an interesting interview with Pat Robertson of 700 Club. William Binney was talking about, he was a former, he was a director there, I think a director of security, that actually they illegally surveil people, find out stuff about them, then lie in court and say they don't, and then say they got it from some other means. So my short question is, if you are elected, would you vote to defund such like the NSA activity, that activity?
Oh, I'm going to be absolutely on the side of defunding any criminal behavior in the name of the government. When our founding fathers put that, what I think is the second greatest document ever written behind the Holy Bible, the United States Constitution, this thing is absolutely brilliant, and it's only been changed, just 20 or so sometimes, in its history. But they could not have envisioned the technological accomplishments that digitally that society has now brought to bear, and things like the NSA, things like Facebook, that have gathered so much data about average citizens who just voluntarily handed a lot of it over, but then just through herd tactics, the Facebook is a dangerous thing. When you can completely ruin someone's life forever by exposing, just simple things like what's on your grocery list, and the government then has access to those types of tools. Richard, my goodness, I'm not a conspiracy theorist until I have to be.
Right.
And this is certainly one of those areas where we're going to have to rein in these types of access to free-wielding government officials. I mean, you would actually have to go, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, and you have to send detectives out. You have to send G-men out, government men out to search through your trash cans to find out if you were up to no good or just to surveil you. Now, virtually every American is surveilled in some way. I mean, there'll be government officials that'll probably watch this broadcast just to see if we're saying anything too radical, and that's got to stop. I'm most certainly on the side of reining all that in.
Okay, and another related question, and this has to do with the issue of forced vaccination, which on the state level, I guess you're aware, there's the issue of mandating vaccines for school attendance. And on the national level, especially now with the COVID-19, we're hearing talk of having to have a card saying you're immunized. Perhaps Mr. Gates says he wants to immunize, I should say not immunize, but vaccinate every person on earth, because that doesn't actually guarantee immunity. But anyway, and so would you, if it ever came up on a national level, I know it's primarily handled in the states, would you support or oppose what I call forced or mandatory vaccinations?
Well, thankfully in West Virginia in 1994, we passed a law that gave our citizens, a religious exemption.
But we don't have a religious exemption in West Virginia.
Well, we've got pretty close to it, and so if you're a citizen who's willing to readily bow down to a federal government that tells you what you can and can't put into your body, I'm going to challenge you right there. I've never been kind of the person that would just go along with the flow. I'm always a why person. I need to understand why you're having me do this. And there certainly can be an argument made for, listen, we have known pathogens, measles and mumps and some of those types of things that vaccinations certainly help to defend us against. But we have to look at it from a bigger perspective. Individual freedom is what makes America America. You don't get to have individual freedom in countries like China. Matter of fact, in China, they have this expression that goes something like, your creativity and individuality is causing me problems. Well, that's antithetical to Americanism, which is, hey, I came, our ancestors, our forefathers came to this country to live freely, and it'll be up to me to take care of me. It'll be up to me to defend myself against bears and against ruffians and against pathogens. And so I'm a big believer in individual freedom on these types of things, but I do know that with freedom comes responsibility, and that's what we call liberty. Absolute freedom is anarchy, and I'm not for that. And liberty is kind of freedom with some guide rails on it. So I would look very carefully at anything where the government is forcing the entire populations to engage in, and right. Vaccination is being one of those.
Okay, so a related question is, in 1986, there was a National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act passed, and that has basically removed liability for pharmaceutical companies from being sued. And instead, we have the so-called vaccine court. The intention of the law was originally we'd have the vaccine court, which has given out more than $4.2 billion of compensation for injuries. So there's no question that vaccines can injure and kill. But the point about it is that there's been a proliferation of vaccines due to the removal of liability. And that resulted from changes made through amendment to that bill and also a 2011 Supreme Court decision. So the short question is, would you support putting in the ability again to, like, for parents or people who are injured to sue pharmaceutical companies? And yeah, that's the main thing, as in like an amendment to that act. Would you support that? And also,
I would, especially in scenarios, or maybe just limited to scenarios where in order to access public funds, like to attend a public school, you're basically boxed into a scenario where you're going to have to get your child this specific vaccination.
Yeah, and some have aborted fetal cells, as you probably know.
Right. I am aware that there's still a couple of lines out there that are used for various purposes that were started back in the late 70s and 80s. But I think we've gotten away from most of those. I work with one of the national pro-life organizations, Americans United for Life, which are experts on all of these things. So they keep us up to date and in the loop on what kind of testing is done and what vaccinations are still out there that are using these types of things. And thankfully, most of those have gone by the wayside. But yeah, if there's injury where you've been forced basically into a scenario where you had no other choice but to vaccinate, then sure, I would vote for that amendment.
Okay. Yeah, I guess and this is obviously, you can see something that's important to, yeah, I'm very interested in. And I think it's a major issue that is related to like the constitutional issues we see even now during the COVID-19 of restriction on freedoms. Another one is like a related one. Would you support like having safety studies for any upcoming vaccines, saying there have to be independent safety studies against like unvaccinated populations, meaning right now, most people don't know, no vaccine, literally none, has ever been tested for the overall effect on mortality. In other words, no one knows if it kills more people than it helps. And yet states like West Virginia mandate these vaccines, and they're also recommended by the CDC. So would you support like and CDC is not impartial, having safety studies before vaccines release to show that actually it is more beneficial or harmful, which they do not do now and have resisted vehemently. And, even for the ones that are currently on the market, having those safety studies, because right now they're just not there.
Absolutely. The more information the public has, the better. And I mean, my goodness, we have to have safety studies done on new types of staplers that sit on your desk. How much more do we need safety information on something that's going to be forced through a syringe into your bloodstream?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good thing. Yeah, I hope in West Virginia, I know you're running for the U.S. Senate, but we're trying to fix our West Virginia laws too, because we don't have the religious exemptions. Frankly, I don't think, vaccines should be mandatory, period. I mean, I'm not against them personally, but I think like we're saying, it's our individual responsibility. It's a different thing to say your kids don't have access to school unless that's forced vaccination.
Well, I work at the state capitol as a lobbyist, and have had for years, and these issues come up almost every year. And right now, there's not been a lot of momentum in the last 2 or 3 years to address anything vaccination related. But I'm now running for the United States Senate, hopefully to have an influence nationwide on all this health policy. I'm a former executive for Blue Cross Blue Shield, so these are all areas that I've been in and around for many years. I've been involved to some degree with the CDC even since my college days. So I'm thankful that we've got a current administration that is concerned about these types of things. We have the president's ear, we have the administration's ear on these types of things, and they're definitely leaning more towards a freedom-based worldview than a let's control everybody's life worldview, which is what we're going to have with the Democrats, who have basically become socialists.
Yeah,
So,
I hope so, but let me interject one. I know I'm cutting you off a little. I am concerned, and of course, I like the freedom-based view, and what President Trump is doing, but I am very concerned about Dr. Fauci and those guys, because they're really conflicted with the whole agenda of getting money from the Bill Gates Foundation, funding the Wuhan lab that allegedly released the vaccine. And yeah, here's the guy making our policy, and then President Trump is saying he's I forget the name, pushing the vaccine. I'm kind of worried. Have you thought about that?
Well, I have, and the short answer to encapsulate all of that is that there's 3 or 4 times too many employees in Washington, D.C. that live off of the public dole. And I'm not a fan of Dr. Fauci. Uh, those are individuals that have been left over from previous administrations. There is a move right now, even among some of my colleagues in Washington, D.C., to slide out of the activist positions where they've been and over onto the government payroll positions because they are protected. They basically can't be, most of them, they're not appointed, they're non-appointed positions. You basically can't fire these people. And that's problematic. And the average American that's willing to just sit back and listen to everything that comes off of every podium and believe it's true, well, that's a terrible idea no matter what country you're in. And America's not impervious to having people that are in Washington, D.C. simply because there's a lot of sizzle. That's one of the things when you start to see a career politician, very much like my opponent, Senator Capito, she's been there now coming up on 18, 19 years. And I'm not a term limits guy because I believe it's more difficult for conservatives to replace a good conservative than it is for liberals to find another liberal. I think that it's a matter of the First Amendment right of free speech. If, Richard, you and I want to continue to elect our same magistrate, year after year after year, because they're doing a great job, I don't want to be forced to go out and find a new person. Same way with my United States senators. So I believe it's up to the people. And so just because someone's been there for forever doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. But you know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I believe that it's time for a change. And look, I've got a pair of parachute pants and a tiny little skinny leather tie left over from my 80s prom. But I don't still wear it because it's from the 80s. And in West Virginia, we are continuing to elect names, like Manchin and Capito, et cetera, names that are left over from the 80s that maybe we should look towards the 2020s as opposed to looking backwards for our leadership.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, definitely. Well, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share with our viewers? I think you've differentiated yourself, and yeah. But the thing about the constitutional freedoms, also the forced vaccination issue. By the way, there was some movement here in West Virginia. I've been actively working on an issue with West Virginia's health freedom and other groups. There were several bills in the West Virginia. I know you're running for Senate, but just since you mentioned, you're working as a activist. They were, but and I researched it I researched it back more than 2 decades, or 33 bills for vaccine exemptions in West Virginia. One of them I think 93 passed the Senate, but not the House. And they're almost always 100%, 99.999 killed in the health committee. They never see the light of day. But there were a number of bills introduced, but they never saw the light of day. They never get to vote on the floor. I'm pretty confident they would pass the West Virginia House and have a good shot in the Senate, but they never see the light of day. It's very frustrating. Anyway, I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, I don't really. Every year there's a couple of thousand bills that are introduced. Most of them don't see the light of day, and the West Virginia legislature is technically it's controlled. All three houses are controlled by Republicans technically, even though the governor was elected as a Democrat and then changed parties. But our leadership in the Senate, they're by no means, you and I, Richard, they're by no means conservatives who are concerned about these issues. There's probably not 5 Republican senators in the state of West Virginia that are concerned about vaccinations, and there's probably only about 25 members of the House that would be concerned. So we don't have the right people in place to even address this issue. So yeah, we can get one friendly legislator to introduce 50 bills, but they're not going to go anywhere until we change the makeup of the legislature within the state of West Virginia. But to kind of give you a summation of my race for the United States Senate now,
okay,
we must defend small business owners First Amendment rights to free speech to be able to operate their businesses according to their belief structures. That's how America was founded. And right now, we've got a senator in place that's not willing to take the lead on any of that. As a matter of fact, she's on the wrong side of these issues. Two, you sound like you're a conservative guy, Richard, that you're up on the issues. You're probably very astute, and you run a media company there where you're trying to spread the word to voters. You know what? That makes you a little suspicious sounding to the government and to liberals in all likelihood. And so you're going to, at some point, hopefully you won't, but perhaps at some point you're going to need to defend yourself to the Second Amendment. And you maybe own firearms, I don't know. But
I'm a firearms owner.
Well, most certainly, you shouldn't have your firearms removed from you because of this broadcast, because of your views, because of controversial statements perhaps you might have made or your guests might have made. And the ability for law enforcement to come over and without any due process take your firearms because someone has watched your show and raised what we know as a red flag, those things must never happen in this country. And my opponent, Senator Capito, just in the fall, it was after that terrible shooting out in El Paso at the Walmart and a lot of people perished. Senator Capito was asked by a reporter, hey, are we going to pass some more gun restrictions? What about red flag laws where people can raise a red flag? Senator Capito said, we're going to get back as quick as we can, and we're going to take a really hard look at that. No, Richard. The Second Amendment says it shall not be infringed. And just because someone might have raised a red flag, one of your viewers who doesn't like your guests, or they don't like your opinions on vaccinations, should not be able to call law enforcement, raise a red flag, and they come over without any due process and remove your firearms. That is unconstitutional. I'm the only candidate who openly opposes those things. And then, finally, the simple concept that the government is here to save you, that you can rely to have your health and your wealth and your welfare all taken care of by elected and non-elected bureaucrats, in Washington, D.C., that's not something that sits well with me. It put me into the race because we didn't have a Republican senator or a senator of any kind in West Virginia who was willing to stand up and take those bold positions. So, yeah, I'm taking on a well-known and historically well-liked Republican incumbent, and a lot of the Republican establishment scoffed at me. How dare you take on our beloved senator? Well, her record is terrible on many of these issues.
Right.
She's open and bold about them. There are a dozen or so conservative organizations in Washington, D.C. who rank all of our elected members of Congress, and the highest one that's conservative, the American Conservative Union, only has her ranked at 68.2%. From there, they fall off to 50 and 40 and 30 and some even 20% conservative. So I believe that West Virginia deserves better than a D- for their Republican senator when it comes to a conservative score. And so I stepped up and said, Lord, send me. And so here I am.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for being on. And, this will be available through our video and podcast. And I hope lots of people see it. And because we do, like you said, I think it is key. We do need to, elect informed, godly people. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And, we're very glad to have you.
Well, hey, I'm glad to be on, Richard, and you get the honor of seeing my my quarantine beard for the last time because it's going to go away tomorrow. So,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're gonna end this interview. I do thank you for joining us and all the viewers for joining us. I'm Richard Urban, reporting from historic Harpers Ferry, and we will see you next time on the Richard Urban Show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Whitt. Okay, bye-bye.